Hello, Jennifer. Good afternoon and welcome to Wired's live living room sessions. Today is our 16th episode, so if you've missed many or all of our episodes to date, we encourage you to go to our YouTube channel, click, subscribe, and start viewing them. On Tuesday, we enjoyed a lively discussion with CPRI's Jen Ward Clark and three permaculture design graduates from across the region. Jen explored with Fiona from Guadeloupe, Nia from the British Virgin Islands, and Celia from Barbados their rewarding PDC experience and the benefits and challenges they have faced since completing the course. If you've missed it, remember it's as easy as click, subscribe, watch. If you're joining us for the first time, my name is Keisha Farnham and I'm from Walker's Institute for Regenerative Research, Education and Design, Wired. And we are pleased to bring you this series in collaboration with our education partners, the Caribbean Permaculture Research Institute, and powered by the Inter-American Development Bank. We will be continuing for the month of June to explore the topics of regenerative agriculture, climate change, building biodiversity, and renewable energy every Thursday and Tuesday at 1 p.m. What we do in the Caribbean has serious impacts on our longevity as a region. What do we mean when we say that the Caribbean is vulnerable? How do we address this systemic vulnerability? We will be answering these questions and much more today with Dr. Justin Ram. Justin is a global economist, educator, and consultant. He has 25 years of professional experience as the former director of economics at the Caribbean Development Bank, Supervisory Economist with the Mayor of London and Greater London Authority, as an economist with the United Kingdom's Government Department for Transport, Senior Global Economist with Worley Parsons, Technical Advisor with Jacob Engineering, and is an analyst with Reuters. He has taught at London School of Economics and Political Science and the University of the West Indies. As a consultant, he has worked on many projects in Central Asia, Africa, Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and has worked with several development agencies, including the World Bank, the United Nations, and the International Labour Organization. Welcome, Justin. It is indeed a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Keisha. It is my pleasure to be here with you and the audience. I'm very much looking forward to discussing this very topical issue, what it means to be vulnerable in the Caribbean and what do we need to do in order to build back better and certainly to build resilience.
I mean, the topic is definitely very much at the forefront of a lot of people's minds. You know, we're still in the midst of a global pandemic and we're heading into hurricane season, to add icing to the not too tasty cake. But definitely it is something that as a region, we need to understand. And I know that for a lot of us, we hear, the region's vulnerable, but what does that actually mean? And so jumping straight into the discussion, just kind of outlining what does that concept of vulnerability mean? It's a very dynamic concept. It's also very relative depending on the country, etc. And there's a whole bunch of factors that come together to decide, how vulnerable a country is or how vulnerable a region is. But how would you define vulnerability in the context of the Caribbean?
Well, first of all, Keisha, I think it's important for us to understand the origins of the word vulnerability. Vulnerability has come from the Latin word vulnus, which really means to be wounded. And so when you think about vulnerability, you have to consider, even from a personal point of view, are there situations that I can be in where it's easy for me to be wounded? So let me just give you an example. Suppose that I have taken a decision to go into a war zone. As you would imagine, if I'm walking around in a war zone, I am very vulnerable to be hurt. And that vulnerability can be physical and it can actually be emotional as well. Now, what can I do in order to avoid myself from being vulnerable in a situation like that? Well, I can perhaps wear armored clothing, or I can drive around in an armored vehicle, or more importantly, I could just decide not to go into that war zone. And so I'm not putting myself in a vulnerable position. Now, if I think about that analogy as it relates to the Caribbean, when we speak about vulnerability in the Caribbean, what are the war zones that we are speaking about? We're speaking about economic war zones. We're speaking about environmental war zones. We're speaking about social war zones. Now, in the first analogy, as an individual, one of the options that I had was that I could avoid going into the war zone. Yes, and so
Yeah.
I will not be vulnerable. The problem we have in the Caribbean is that we cannot avoid many of these war zones that are around us.
Yeah.
So the point I really want to make to the audience is that what we then have to do is to ensure that we are well armored against these things that are around us. And that is economic vulnerability. That comes from anywhere around the world. So for example, with COVID-19, out of nowhere, we realized that again we were vulnerable, but
Yeah.
we didn't have the armor to deal with that up front. We know definitely that we are vulnerable environmentally from the many hurricanes or so that are around, and so we need to try to build our armor against that. And
Yeah.
similarly, on social issues, we are quite vulnerable when I think about the amount of young people that are still unemployed, or the significantly high levels of poverty that we still have. We need to build our armors around that to ensure that we no longer have those types of vulnerabilities. So I hope that sort of tries to explain it in an analogy, where unfortunately for us in the Caribbean, we don't have much choices, and so our
Yes.
choice is really whether we arm ourselves against the many vulnerabilities that we have.
Yeah. So if what you've just said, some of the things that just kind of jump out to me is that we are vulnerable in our ability to cope, in our ability to resist, and in our ability to recover from global impacts, right? And those global impacts take different forms. We're quite accustomed in the Caribbean to vulnerability as it relates to natural disasters. And even in that, we still haven't quite found our footing in terms of how do we recover from these disasters? How do we prepare for these disasters and mitigate in advance of? And what structures and so forth we need to put in place. But now we find ourselves also vulnerable as it relates to other factors. And so this has really created an opportunity for us to, as a region, look at the full plethora of things that can impact us, and then look at what are some of the common interventions that we can use that can hit more than one more than one war at the same time, right? And we are a small
Yeah.
region, so we do have to try to find ways to stack functions in the way that we address our vulnerability. One of the issues, definitely one of the things that has been on the table for the region for a while and has definitely been growing across the region, is the need for renewable energy, and looking at how what role renewable energy has to play in diversifying our economies across the region, particularly for not only just for countries like Barbados, but also for countries that are very dependent on fossil fuel like Trinidad. And Guyana is now moving into that space as well. So looking at renewable energy, what role would you say that renewable energy plays in reducing vulnerability?
Thanks. So let me just go back to some research that I had done while I was still Director of Economics at the Caribbean Development Bank. Some research done with an economist, Jason Cotton, as well as two research analysts, Wayne Elliott and Raquel Frederick. Excellent economists, I should say. Now, in that work, we tried to come up with what's called a multidimensional vulnerability index for the Caribbean. And so we looked at the economic, the social, and environmental vulnerabilities. On the economic, we recognize that many of our countries are highly vulnerable because of the high cost of importing fuel. That actually leads to a lot of vulnerability for our economies. And on the flip side, for the countries that export fossil fuels, they're also quite vulnerable when it comes to the price associated with that particular commodity. So for us in the Caribbean, it's actually, when you look at it, an imperative that we think about investing in renewable energy from the standpoint of reducing our economic vulnerabilities. Now, if I can remind the audience that one of the problems we also have here in the Caribbean is that we are highly uncompetitive. When you look at the World Bank's ease of doing business indicators,
Mm-hmm.
one thing is quite clear is that we don't perform very well. In fact, I think the last set of indicators showed that out of about 191 countries, on average, the Caribbean countries rank about 125. Now, let me just put this into perspective for many of the audience members who might be listening. There are places in conflict around the world that rank better than 125. So, for example, Gaza and the West Bank probably ranks about 115. So, as you can see, we're not doing very well when you consider where we should be.
Yeah.
Now, one of the reasons why we are so uncompetitive is because of our high cost of fuel, our high cost of electricity. And I think if we're able to invest in renewable energy, whereby we can get a price of electricity or a price of energy that is much more certain, then you will start to see a lot more economic activity starting to take place in the Caribbean. What I think we have in the Caribbean is a lot of latent economic activity. There's probably some young person out there right now who would like to be an entrepreneur in some area, but when they look at all of the costs associated with doing any entrepreneurial activity in the Caribbean, including the cost of energy, they are going to tell themselves, no, this is quite prohibitive and I'm not going to do it. We
Mm-hmm.
need to be investing in renewable energy because it will be good for our competitiveness, it will be good for building our resilience. And one last thing I should say, if we are quite serious that the impacts and the effects of climate change are affecting us negatively, then we need to also be putting our money where our mouths are. We should be considering turning our economies into green economies. We should be moving away from the use of fossil fuels because, as everyone who's probably listening here understands, fossil fuels contribute significantly to the changing climate, which in turn has such a negative impact on us, from which we know about every June 1st to about November 30th during the hurricane season. So I think we need to put our money where our mouths are and say, look, we are going to be moving towards green, resilient, and inclusive societies, and that includes a renewable energy future. I
Yeah.
should also say that one thing that we should consider, it's easy for individuals to be part of this bandwagon. All of us, if we had the right incentives, could perhaps start putting solar panels on our roofs
Mm-hmm.
and start generating electricity for our own homes, and then perhaps feeding that any excess electricity back to the grid. And so the feed-in tariffs, I think that we need to ensure that the regulations around these mechanisms need to be in a way that incentivizes even individuals to be part of this transition to a renewable energy future.
Yeah. You mentioned green economies, and we should be moving into green economies. If you had to just give our audience an idea of what a green country, a green economy country would look like, what would that look like?
Well, first of all, I think there would be one of the great measures of this would be your carbon intensity of your economy. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, we might look at the GDP output of one country and say, okay, in order to produce that level of GDP, how much carbon emissions am I producing per person in that country? We would then go on a path to try to reduce that levels of carbon emissions per capita or per dollar of output down to zero over time. For me, that's an important indicator of greening your economy. Now, that's not an easy thing to do. It
Mm.
means that we have to now move away from the conventional ways of doing things. Immediately, combustion engines, the type of vehicles that we use on our roads become obsolete. If that's what we mean by moving towards a green economy, we would
Yeah.
now need to move towards propulsion mechanisms that do not use fossil fuels at all, because now we're trying to bring that down to zero. There are other things that we can look at as well. So, for example, how do we do our agriculture? How do we engage in our fisheries? Do we catch fish every year in a sustainable way, what's called a sustainable harvest, in a way that allows the fish stocks to then also regenerate themselves? So greening means that you're doing things in a way that is sustainable over time. And most importantly, I think a good measure of this is to say, look, what I have found here is, as a member of the current generation, I am ensuring that I am at least leaving this or something better for future generations, for those who might be very young now and for those who are yet unborn. So I think that when you look at it, the carbon emissions is a good indicator, as well as what are you leaving behind for future generations would be a good indicator of greening your economy.
Yeah. One of the things that resonates with what you're saying too is that definitely it's not just one sector's problem. It's not just one sector that has to, has to be addressed. It's it's very much a holistic approach, and we use that word very often. A holistic approach. But it definitely means that you need to have a number of stakeholders all bringing their expertise and resources to the fore to be able to bring this to reality. And when we talk about reducing vulnerability, we hear a lot of persons talking about now, post in the post-COVID world, the post-COVID economy, that we can't go back to business as usual, right? And when you look at the traditional approaches and interventions that have been put forward to reduce vulnerability, some of them have just not been working. So in looking at the approaches that we use across the Caribbean to reduce vulnerability, what are some of the practical steps that the Caribbean can take in order to, reduce our vulnerability as a region?
Yeah. Keisha, I think that's a fantastic question, and one which I think everyone in the Caribbean really needs to ponder over right now. Maybe about 2 weeks ago, I published a paper on how do we finance building resilience, and in that paper, I've been arguing that the problem that we have, if I look at this as a distribution curve, and let's say on my y-axis I have something called the costs associated with vulnerability, and then I have on the x-axis frequency. Now, if there was a normal distribution, as it were, we would have a smooth bell curve. And for anyone who's done statistics would understand that. But the problem that we have in the Caribbean is that we're operating sort of out to the right. The frequency by which we are hit by exogenous shocks, so things that we can't control, and the costs associated with those things mean that these things are happening quite frequently in the Caribbean. I think, for example, when you look at what happened with Hurricane Dorian in Bahamas last year, we were like, wow, how is it possible that a hurricane would sit over a group of islands for almost 2 days? These are things that we have not seen before. Yeah. But I think what's happening is that the frequency and the intensity of these types of events are happening much more often. So from that point of view, we have to ask ourselves, we have been doing things in a certain way for a long time. The conventional way, the traditional ways of doing things. Have these things worked for us? I would say in many ways, many of those things have not worked for us. In fact, they have contributed significantly to our overall levels of vulnerability. So take, for example, in that paper, I wrote about the financing mechanisms that we have. Mm-hmm. Currently, as you know, the problem that you have when you're vulnerable, if you want to build resilience can be quite costly. But on top of that, Keisha, it costs you a lot in terms of interest rate, because currently the conventional thinking in finance is that if you are vulnerable, we're not sure if you're going to pay us back, so I'm going to charge you a high level of interest rate. Yeah. And so what we need to do now is turn this totally on its head and say to financiers, no, I need to get those resources as cheap as possible. Now, it means that once I've built my resilience, that in the future, I would have avoided many costs. There would be greater sense of business continuity. And so it's highly likely that the rate of return in the future will be a lot higher. Maybe at that time, I can reward you, Mr. or Mrs. Financier, for showing faith in me early on and giving me those resources at a cheap cost right now. And then I can reward you later on as my economy improves or as my resilience improves. And then there's another thing that I think is important in this. Too many people in society are not the owners, or they don't have an equity stake in the economy. I think that the financing mechanisms that we consider now we have to ensure that we give many more people in society an equity stake in our economies.
Yeah.
And what would that do? So if we're saying to Keisha, I'm just asking you, give me $100 or $200 to invest in building resilience today. Keisha, I would say to you, over time, you would get a higher return as this economy and as this asset builds resilience. But more importantly, I will give you an ownership stake in that asset. I think you would find that to be quite attractive.
Yeah,
In
and you're
that way,
more likely to work harder to make sure that it works because you're now invested, right? You have skin in the game.
exactly. You have a
Yeah.
lot of skin in the game, and I think this also improves a challenge that we have in the region, which is to improve our governance framework. Because
Yeah.
if you now have a strong invested interest and have an equity stake in the economy and within your own society, you will be
Mhm.
keeping the policymakers, you will be keeping them to account on a daily basis rather than every 5 years or so. I think that when I think about this whole issue, the current government in Barbados summed it up very well when they spoke about the need to build enfranchisement. How do you give people an equity stake in the economy? For me, I think that as we go forward, that's an important consideration which we need to consider. We need to give more people an equity stake in the economy so that they now have a real stake in building resilience. That's how I think we need to turn things around.
Yeah, facilitating the inclusion of local person, the average person, in shaping the agenda becomes very critical in this type of change that we're talking about. Because for many of us, for those of us who do have an idea of the issues, it may be, it generally tends to be two strata of persons. One, the ones who are experts in the field, such as yourself, and then those who may choose to read up, etc. They may not be, and again, it may be because they have a business, they have skin in the game, they have something. But for the average person, a lot of the issues that they're experiencing and how that relates to the bigger macro picture of things, they don't really understand all the moving parts. And because they don't understand, then they can't take action and they can't ask for what they need either. As meaningful participants within a society, if you don't understand what the issues are. I'm just going to take the opportunity to reframe for persons who are joining us. I am talking to Dr. Justin Ram. He is a global economist, educator, consultant, and we are talking about the very, very complex issue of vulnerability within the Caribbean and all of its different elements and what we can do to reduce it. I mean, we only have 1 hour. I mean, this is a very, very extensive topic. So we're trying to hit on some of the key points, some of the key issues. And so falling back into the conversation, when we look at the role of technology in the digital economy, we see that there's a lot of opportunities there in terms of how we can see vulnerability being addressed within the Caribbean. As per usual, the Caribbean is behind in terms of technology, etc., in certain areas. But there is an opportunity for us, particularly with everything that's happening, for us to kind of leapfrog into the future using the best practice technologies that are available right now. And so looking at that whole question of technology and the digital economy, what role do you think that they can play in reducing vulnerability?
Again, it's critical that we take advantage of the opportunities associated with the digital economy. Why I say that is that there is a move. Things are becoming a lot more automated. Artificial intelligence is all around us now, so that we have to take advantage of the digital economy from a number of angles. First of all, I think when you look at what's happened with respect to COVID-19, now everyone is perhaps doing meetings online, engaging in activities online. In fact, I understand people have Friday Night Limes online as well. And very soon, I would imagine that even business meetings where people would normally meet at, let's say, a restaurant might start happening online. But I
Yeah.
think what this has shown us is that using the digital, we can actually reduce the cost of our businesses considerably, and so therefore make our businesses a lot more competitive. So
Yeah.
before, we might have thought that we needed to have rented an office space and have a whole lot of equipment before we could start a business. Many people might now say, well, with this, I now have an opportunity to do some of the entrepreneurial activity that I always wanted to do because
Yeah.
my overhead can be reduced quite significantly.
Yeah. One of
Secondly, I think that
sorry,
go,
I was
yeah,
just gonna give, I'll say a very playful anecdote. Even my parents are going to church online. You know, they've been
yeah,
having for the last 2 months, they've been having all of their sessions online. And I think, you know, for a lot of people who never even imagined themselves using Zoom or any of the other technology to be able to
yeah.
communicate and to get things done within the space of 2 to 3 months, you know, people are up to speed, you know. So it's really been quite amazing how technology has stepped in, but also people's willingness to embrace it in order to be able to keep moving forward and to keep doing the things that they enjoy.
Yes, yes, and I think it is time for us that we understand that our students in schools, you know, the young people coming through our education system, that they really need to be in tune with the digital economy. And so the curriculum really needs to be adjusted to ensure that when they come out of secondary school, or even if they come out of university, they must be willing to embrace and to use this in order to advance their careers, either that through employment or maybe being self-employed. I think that
Yeah,
that's critical. We need to reorient our education system towards that. Now, as it
yeah,
comes back to your particular question as what it means with respect to technology and digital economy, the role that that plays with vulnerability, I think that this simply comes down to digital allowing us to have greater sense of business continuity. Yes,
hmm,
I think we have all recognized that in this COVID-19 era, without the digital, without the technology, businesses would not have been able to survive. Meetings would not have happened. And so that's business continuity is important.
yeah,
But finally, I think that an important area that we need to embrace is the digitalization of our currencies. Um, we need to be moving towards the use of digital in everything that we do payment wise. And I think that it's time for our countries to embrace the digitalization of our currencies so that you can have your electronic or smart wallet on your phone when you go to any place to make a purchase. You can then use that. You go to the market, you simply scan and share your information with the vendor, and you can make the payments. Now, this also helps with another area of vulnerability, which is on the social front, because too many people have been unbanked for a long time. And if we're
hmm,
able to digitalize the currencies immediately, we then give anyone access to a digital account. And with that, Keisha, you could imagine we're able to do credit ratings quite easily based on individuals' transactions, because no longer do we have to ask someone to fill in a paper form. The bank or whoever can simply just look at these transactions and say, okay, based on your activity, I can give you a loan for such and such. And immediately that then transforms the opportunities for many people who are currently have no access to credit at the moment. So
yeah,
the reason I say that again, the opportunities are tremendous, but the opportunities are so much greater for those who are not using or not even using some of the conventional forms of technology that we have now. I mean, to start thinking about embracing this for their benefit as well.
yeah. It's like, you know, as a region, we have so much untapped potential, so much untapped economic potential. And it's definitely going to be a gate opener, you know, for so many people who are unable to participate the way that they would like and in a productive manner. You now have this opportunity for them to be able to do that. Within that whole scope of technology and the digital economy, I think one of the things too is looking at different types of businesses that can be run remotely, and you have a lot of people being able to, you know, stay in Barbados and, you know, because throughout the region we have the issue of brain drain, which is a whole other topic all by itself. But you know, being persons being able to work remotely and being able to do so quite effectively does allow for a number of jobs to be created even within that sector. Do you have any comments on that in terms of the economic activity that could happen in that type of scenario?
I think so. I mean, you know, I am currently a great example of that. I think Many people would have known me as being director of economics at Caribbean Development Bank for
Mm-hmm.
7 years, and I left CDB not too long ago. But I was then able to, of course, establish a fintech company um, relatively easy, and that means that I can actually now utilize resources from anywhere around the world. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I really don't have to have a physical office space, but I can tap into resources anywhere who I think can assist me with the development of the product that I am building out. And
Yeah.
so I want to flip that over into saying to anyone out there who's living in Barbados or anyone across the region, you can also be doing the same thing from either setting up a business or even providing services to many business across the globe. If you think about this now, we were saying, wow, globalization has caused this COVID-19 pandemic to be worse than it is. Well, no, if you really look at it now, this era of this digital movement means that globalization, we can work anywhere across the world now quite easily. And so
Yeah.
I really want to say to anyone in the Caribbean, use the technology and realize that the world is now truly your oyster via the technology. And just to try and get people to know that you have a service available to 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 provide to them wherever they are in this world. And maybe that now also has a role for some sort of an agency to come together and say, okay, in the Caribbean, if you're doing X and Y, register with us and we can help advertise your skills globally so that
Yeah.
now the world truly becomes our oyster. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And I think what your comments segue really nicely into what I was going to ask you next, which was about your future projects. Um, and if you could just give us an idea of, what are your future projects, and how do they correlate to reducing vulnerability in the region?
Right. So at the moment I am actually CEO and co-founder of a company called GSEC, and that
Mm-hmm.
really stands for Government Securities. And I guess observing what I've been seeing across the region for a number of years is that we need to find a way, some of the things that I spoke about before, we need to find a way of how do we democratize investments? How do I say to Keisha, to anyone listening online, that I can give you a stake in your economy through a digital platform? So GSEC is really a platform that allows a government or state-owned enterprise or public entity to issue securities or bonds on this platform, and so that anyone can have the opportunity to purchase those securities or bonds. Now, we use, of course, the blockchain technology, which allows us
Mm-hmm.
to abide by any regulatory requirements anywhere in the world. We can build that into our codes, so that all of your know your customer, your anti-money laundering, or your countering finance for terrorism, all of these things can be done quite easily. But I
Mm-hmm.
think what's most important here is that I'm saying to the average person who has not thought about investing in their countries, you can now take an ownership, and we're going to make that quite easy for you to do through this electronic platform. And
Yeah.
furthermore, you can trade these securities quite easily. So anytime you want to get back your money, you can find a buyer for your bond or your security online, and you can get your money. So that secondary market trading is also a critical component of what we are attempting to address. Of course, now this can be expanded to many other opportunities. So take, for example, if we go back to the renewable energy, if there
Mm-hmm.
is a utility or even someone wanting to raise resources to put up, let's say, a solar park, or so that they can generate more electricity from solar, and they don't have the resources, we can perhaps help them raise those revenues or those finances on our platform, and at the same time give the ordinary person an opportunity to have a stake in that investment. So these are the type of things that that we are doing. And I saw this, and I thought to myself, there's too much money in the banking sector and too much liquidity that's earning very low rates of interest. How can I get some of those resources that belong to the people of the Caribbean, invest in our own economies? And so it's now trying to flip this narrative around, whereby most of the time we are really trying to attract foreign direct investment. Why not utilize some of our own savings to invest in our own sectors, and those sectors then start earning foreign exchange, or perhaps doing import substitution? So I'm turning and flipping this around, trying to help us build resilience, and that's the main thing that I'm doing now.
Excellent. You know, listening to you speak, one of the spill-on effects too of what, besides us being, more economically active and being more invested, and of course building resilience from an economic point of view, what seems to resonate for me too as well is that there will be improved governance with this kind of structure too as well, because people are now paying more attention, again, because of that whole idea of skin in the game, to what's happening, to the policies that are being put in place, to the policies that they ask for, to how we hold our politicians accountable. So I see a lot of really positive, from my sociological point of view, positive spill-on effects to this type of engagement within the region.
Yeah, Keisha, you're absolutely correct. And so for me, when thinking about going in to do something like this, my first boss, when I first came out of university, always said to me, Justin, you have to consider a number of things when you consider what you're going to do in your life. Is what you're going to do going to provide a benefit to society? So I started to think about this venture. I think, yes, this would provide a real benefit, because I will provide a platform whereby ordinary person can have an equity stake in the economy. And secondly, that governance metric can be improved considerably, because what tends to happen now is that people tend to only hold their politicians or their leaders accountable maybe every 5 years or so in the Caribbean. And what I'm saying now is that because you now have and that happens because you only have a passive stake in the economy, because you pay taxes, or you pay value-added tax whenever you buy anything. What I'm saying now is that I want you to have an active stake in the economy by actually investing directly. And so any item on the news now, Keisha, if you're an active investor in this economy, you are paying particular attention to that, because that could impact how your investment performs, and so therefore you now make your policymakers a lot more accountable. So I think for me this is an important step forward, and it comes back to that earlier question that you had about what do we need to do differently in order to build resilience. And I think that this is one of the important areas that we need to focus on, that equity aspect, that improvement of governance, that ownership, and so therefore how we invest is so important.
Excellent. I know we do have some questions from the audience. If you're listening in and you would like to ask a question, please add it. We'll try to get to as many questions as we have. If you're just joining us, we are speaking to Dr. Justin Ram. He is a global economist, educator, and consultant, and we are talking about how we can reduce vulnerability in the Caribbean across a plethora of sectors, and looking at how we can look to new and innovative ways of doing that, using renewable energy, using technology, segueing into the digital economy in a very real and tangible way. So let's take some questions from the audience. Our first question comes from Patrick. Hi, Patrick. What is the difference between the opportunity cost of foreign reserves and the price of RE incentives? Can government not pass that opportunity cost on as an incentive?
I think that's a very very great question, because what Patrick is asking there is that when you are purchasing fossil fuels for the generation of your electricity, that is a drain on your foreign exchange reserves. Now, what we're saying is that if you are able to generate your own electricity using renewable energy, that means that now you're no longer having to pass on those costs. So you're not having that drain on your foreign exchange reserve. So ultimately, there can be some arbitrage there whereby governments can say, okay, because you are now saving us this leakage in foreign exchange, I could provide you with an incentive. Maybe not all of it because you want to have a build-up in foreign exchange reserves, but some of those savings can be passed on as an incentive. And I think that what Patrick is getting to is that because there's an initial upfront cost for investing in renewable energy, maybe you have to import some of those material and equipment initially. Maybe that's the incentive that you need in order to get you to make that first initial investment. Of course, what would be great over time is that if in the region we're able to now start manufacturing and producing this technology ourselves, I think that that's also a very important part of it here. Maybe governments could also say how I could pass on some incentives to incentivize the production of this technology within the region as well.
All right, excellent. Do we have any more questions from the audience? All right, so our next question is from A. Mills. Hello, Dr. Ram. My question, given the lack of competitiveness in the Caribbean, what actions has Barbados taken in the last 6 years to increase the uptake of RE? And what can we learn from that experience? And this is one of our YouTube users. We welcome our YouTube users. We've been streaming live from YouTube for about 2 weeks now. So really excited to have YouTube users.
Okay, well, it's a very, very good question. What is clear is that Barbados was always a leader in the region and perhaps globally when it came to the use of renewable energy. I would think that maybe even as far back as a couple of decades, or even before, you would see on most of the buildings within Barbados, most people use solar water heaters. And that has continued. So it has actually built up a very good tradition and good culture of using solar to heat water, and that has meant that many people have reduced their electricity bills considerably. Now, Barbados has also been at the forefront of improving its regulatory requirements to encourage more and more people to invest and to perhaps put solar panels on their roofs so that they can generate their own electricity for them. But there's probably one thing that needs to happen, and this is important across the region, that we need to look at the feed-in tariffs. How much, for example, you as a generator of energy using your renewable energy equipment get for that excess electricity that you pass on to the grid. It needs to be in a way that provides an incentive for anyone to do that. And perhaps if you're generating a lot more electricity, that amount of money that you receive when you pay that into the electricity grid can perhaps pay back for your investment. So I think that across the region, these feed-in tariffs, the changes in that regulation is quite important for us to encourage a greater uptake, because I think eventually we want to have more and more people generating electricity. It's this sort of a distributed grid approach that we want. Yes. Because as you would imagine, if a hurricane happens and it actually affects the main power station, then if everyone else actually has a capacity to generate electricity, it builds resilience. And so we really want to try to incentivize that. And one of the ways to do that is to ensure that the feed-in tariffs are actually priced in a way that incentivizes people to do that more and more.
Yeah, excellent. That last point, I was actually going to bring that up because it does, again, yes, it's an economic incentive, but then you have that very real benefit of, being able to mitigate a very critical issue that happens every single time we have a natural disaster. So I know we have a lot of questions from the audience, so I'm going to go into the next question from the audience is from Shamir, and he says, has PPPs actually worked to the benefit of SIDS in terms of energy? In terms of energy.
I think we have seen a good example of this, perhaps working in the Caribbean with respect to Jamaica, the Wigton wind farms, and if I'm not mistaken, the latest round of engagements that Jamaica has been trying to build more renewable energy potential in that island, the price of which that electricity can now be sold back to the market is very, very competitive. So yes, we have seen benefits. But let me say this to Shamir, that we now have much greater knowledge as to how we should organize PPP contracts, what we need to do. Now, you need to ensure that you understand the situation that you're going to be using a PPP for, and therefore structure the contracts, structure the arrangements that are actually in line with what you are trying to achieve. It's not a one size fits every situation here. We need to ensure that we structure our contracts in a way that we can actually get the greatest benefits, because the PPP is good because you are able to now share the risk between the private sector and the public sector. And as you know, most private sector are quite adverse to risk. They don't want to be losing the shirts off of their back, and that's quite good. We need to bring that rigor to public sector investment, and so the PPPs can provide that, but we still have to ensure that they're structured well. And I think when I consider the Inter-American Development Bank, the Caribbean Development Bank, has actually good technical assistance to allow countries to structure PPP deals in a way that can actually be beneficial to the country, and so that wouldn't actually lead to a cost later on.
Yeah. Just for the benefit of those who may not know what PPPs are, what are PPPs?
Oh, sorry about that. So PPPs
That's okay.
are public. That's a problem when you're working in these things all the time. So PPPs are public-private partnerships.
Right.
So for example, if a government wants to increase the amount of megawatts of electricity that it has for a particular country, there are practically two ways a government can do this. It can perhaps find the financing itself and build that generation capacity.
Yes.
Or it could perhaps ask a private sector firm to come in and build that. And so the private sector firm puts up the initial capital, and then the private sector firm gets some rewards for that through its payback of its investment over time. Yeah. Now, it's not only electricity we can do this. We can do this with respect to the provision of water, the provision of roads, for example. As you know, anyone who's gone, you pay a toll, for example, and you can, and you can have the private sector now providing roads, because now they have an opportunity to make some profit on that. And that's quite good. And if you think about it, I think coming back to the earlier conversation, if we were to give the individual investors an opportunity to be part of that public-private partnership syndicate, then you are a user of that road, and you're also now benefiting when anybody uses that road, because you're also a part owner. So the PPP model can be extended to the ordinary person as well, to become part owners of that syndicate.
Excellent. All right. Do we have any more questions from the audience? All right. Our next question is from Christina Pula. Christina says, based on statistics, a natural disaster that inflicts damage equivalent to more than 2% of the affected country's GDP can be expected to hit the countries of the Eastern Caribbean at least once every 2.5 years. How can the Caribbean deal with this kind of vulnerability imposed on us by nature? I'm sorry, I read that really choppy, but you got it, right, Justin?
Yes,
Okay.
I got that. And in fact, on an average, every year the Caribbean can lose about 2% of GDP from natural disasters such as hurricanes. So there are a number of things which I think we need to do, and this comes back to why we need to reorient everything that we do. So from a macroeconomic point of view, and that I can say from policymakers, what the government does, what the monetary authority does, that needs to change. Because what has to happen now is that many of our governments run deficits and are building up their debt levels, and so they're not saving. We need to say to our governments, you need to start saving and putting aside money in a rainy day fund, a sovereign wealth fund, as it were. because it's
Yeah.
really important in order to build resilience to exactly what Christina is asking, that we have a pool of resources that we can draw on if we are hit by a natural disaster. Now, it's not a matter of if we will be hit, it's always when, okay? So we need to have governments doing that. Now, that means that governments are now going to have to reduce their expenditures in some areas. That means that on the other side, we need to ensure that our private sector can be the engine of growth. So it comes back to that ease of doing business environment. We need to ensure that the private sector and any entrepreneur out there thinks that they can start a business and be successful in the Caribbean because it's easy to do so. That's important because it now means that governments don't have to employ as many people as before, and they don't have to now spend as much money as they do on some transfers and subsidies, because now they need to put that money into a savings fund.
Yeah.
Now, on the flip side of that as well, on human capital and social development, we need to ensure that we are educating our people so that they can become their own employers or be able to work in this new place where we have a competitive economy. So we
Yeah.
want to ensure that we are bringing down our poverty rates, we're bringing down on our unemployment rates, because once we do that, governments then have more money to save. And then
Exactly.
finally, on the environmental front, we need to ensure that we are building everything to certain standards, so that when a hurricane passes through, I can be pretty sure that bridge is not going to be washed away, or my airport will still be functional the day after the hurricane. So we need to have good codes in place, and we
Yeah.
also need to be able to develop our insurance markets as well. These are some of the things that are critical. So I would say, one, reorient our macroeconomics. Two, reorient our productivity and competitiveness through
Mhm.
our business environment. Three, reorient our social so that we no longer have as many people living in poverty or unemployed, because that drains public expenditure. And then
Mhm.
we need to ensure that whenever we're building, that we build to certain codes. So I would say this to the person asking the question: every decision that we take, we need to interrogate that on a resilience platform. So
Yeah.
what I like to call a resilience interrogation. Is this decision going to build resilience, or is it
Mhm.
not? If it is not going to build resilience, then we need to wheel and come again, as the DJs like to say. Mhm.
Exactly. We have very limited resources with which to get all of this done. So, as you say, you definitely have to make sure that you get it right. I think one issue too that I would add to what it is that you're saying is that in recent years we've seen a decline in development assistance across the world, and financing. Particularly after times of disaster and stuff. Some agencies have stepped up more than others, but in general, when you look at the amount of financing for development that has been in prior years, the trajectory is that it's being reduced more and more and more, and the ways that it could be spent is also being reduced more and more. So there's even more need for us now, exactly what you said, with the government having our rainy day funds. We have to think about it in terms of when these things happen, we need to make sure that we put things in place so we can take care of ourselves as best as possible. I know we have a couple of more questions. I'm going to try to squeeze in at least two more, if it's okay with
Sure.
you, Justin.
Of
And this
course.
question is from Kiki. Kiki said, I missed the beginning, so apologies. Kiki, you can catch the recording on our YouTube channel after, so you haven't missed everything. I missed the beginning, so apologies if this was asked already. But what do you think are the reasons for the resistance in the implementation of renewable energy or development of the sector, given the dependence to import oil in the region? How do you suggest to overcome these challenges?
Well, that's a very, very good question, and we know that whenever there is resistance, there are certain interests who are wedded to the traditional or conventional way of doing things. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the ways that we need to change that is to ensure that the regulatory environment is changed right now. Because when you consider it, most of the utilities across the region have an incentive to still produce electricity using fossil fuels. So I know that a few years ago there was a country in the Caribbean that was trying to change the regulatory environment so that they could have the greater use of renewable energy. But unfortunately, the utilities are part of the legislation, legislative framework. And so the way we generate electricity for many of our utilities generates a lot of money for them, as you would imagine. And so you now have to say to them, okay, you have probably made quite a lot of money, and maybe we do have to pay them out in order for us to change the regulatory environment. Because the problem here is that many of them will oppose any changes because it goes against their own self-interest. So that has been a real hindrance to changes with respect to generation of renewable energy across the region. And that really comes down to the legislative and the regulatory environment that we have. Now, in addition to that, I think the question also comes back to a need for us to educate our people, educate our children about why it is we need to move towards renewable energy. It is no longer acceptable for us to simply say that we are simply going to be using fossil fuels because this is the way it has been. What we are doing by using fossil fuels are actually going against our own self-interest. That means that we are generating the greenhouse gases that impact us every year from June 1st to November 30th with respect to the climatic events that we experience. We are also contributing to that problem. And I'm going to say again here is that we need to put our money where our mouths are and start saying we need to move towards generating most of our electricity using renewable sources as well.
Yeah, excellent. All right, so let's see if we can get one more question in before the top of the hour. This is from one of our YouTube users, Andre. Andre says, good afternoon. As more people in the region move to self-sufficiency in renewable energy, utilizing low-cost lithium batteries, what would be the role of power companies in the region?
It's a very, very good question. And now there are a number of renewable energy technologies. Most of us are aware of the solar energy that can be produced because we live in a beautiful part of the world. So we always have so many days of sunlight, every so many hours of sun every year. So we can utilize that to generate. But as you could imagine, if we don't have sufficient energy storage capacity, so if not everyone has lithium batteries, now there is a need for us to still generate electricity at night when people are at home. In addition to that, we also have significant offshore renewable energy potential in the Caribbean. Many people are not aware of that, but if we were to utilize some of the technologies that are available globally and start generating, for example, wind power offshore, we could actually generate many-fold times the amount of electricity that we actually demand now. Now, I think that the utilities have a role to play in this, to be perhaps maybe the broker of energy. So let's say, for example, we are generating a lot of power from offshore technologies. It's too much for what we actually need to use in Barbados. A utility could perhaps now start thinking about building a grid from Barbados to St. Lucia or to other nearby countries. The technology now exists for us to do that. I've been trying to speak with some engineers about that, and they say, yes, we can do that. And so a utility could perhaps be running the grid that can allow us to sell excess electricity from Barbados to St. Lucia and on. Think about it. If the Caribbean was one single economic space and we had joined up utility electricity grids, then there's a role for a utility to play in distributing that energy throughout the region, depending on where there is excess supply. And so that the utility can be the aggregator and allowing us to sell that excess electricity across the region or even internally within our own domestic markets. So I still think that there is a role. It's a much different role to what utilities probably play now, but there can still be a role as an aggregator and perhaps as a broker in selling excess electricity in different parts of the region.
Excellent. I think, from this conversation, the main takeaway is that we must adapt. We need to have a unified, multi-sectoral, long-term development planning approach to how we deal with our vulnerabilities. And this involves embracing new technologies, whether it be in renewable energy, whether it be in the digital economy, and technologies and in general. And also, of course, more importantly, generating that political will to facilitate the change that needs to happen. So if you have any closing remarks, Justin, now would be the time. We're at the top of the hour.
Okay.
I know the hour has passed so quickly, and I know that we have other questions from the audience. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your questions, but we really thank you for joining us. So, Justin.
Yes. Well, all I can say, Keisha, as I look at what has transpired with respect to the COVID-19 crisis, the protests that we see going on in the United States now because of social injustice and across the world, I think we have come to a very critical point in time now where the conventional and traditional is no longer acceptable. We now need to take hold of this challenge that we have and turn it into our favor. It is time for us to take our challenges and turn those into investable opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
And first persons who should be investing in ourselves is ourselves. And I think that that's important. We need to build a society and economy of equity stakeholders so that we really want our countries to improve and to be resilient over time. So all I can say, Keisha, is that the time has come for us to reorient how we have done things. It is time for us to think differently. It is time for us to say to individuals who constantly say to us, it cannot be done like this because that's now how it is done. We need to start pushing back on that type of thinking and say, no, it can be done. It is time for us to start thinking differently. And this is how we're going to do it. Because traditionally, how we've been doing things have not been working in our favor and have been leading us down a path of vulnerability. And what we need now is to build resilience.
It is no longer business as usual.
No longer.
Time for that has come to an end. Justin, thank you so much. This has been such an enlightening discussion. I think we've been able to cover so much within this hour. To the audience, if you missed any part of today's session, you can catch it on Wired's YouTube channel. Remember, it's as easy as click, subscribe, watch. Join Wired's Living Room sessions again on Tuesday the 9th. At 1 p.m. when CPRI's Jen Ward Clark speaks with TV and radio presenter, producer, and influencer Tracy Fowler about the role that the orange economy or the creative sector can play in championing climate change. And then join me again on Thursday, the 11th of June at 1 p.m. as I speak with Dr. Chelson Braffett about why Barbados is planting 1 million trees and how you can help. So join us again next week. We look forward to having you. Thanks for joining us.